Yes, indeedy do. It's that time again for the Persiflager's Puscast to review the infectious disease literature with commentary for the first 2 weeks of January 2009. For those of you who are sick of this introduction, remember you can always skip ahead to the chapter. This is on iTunes. If you like this podcast, feed my ravenous ego by writing me a glowing review as to how wonderful I am. It makes my day so much better. This is brought to you by Puscast LLC, publisher of the Persiflager's Annotated Compendium of Infectious Facts, Dogma, and Opinion, your uber hyperlinked electronic guide to infectious diseases at Pusware.com. All the opinions are those of Mark Crislip, MD, and Pusware LLC, and not those of anyone else who knows the difference between the burrow and a burrow. This is CME accredited, so when you're done, take the online quiz and get a half an hour of free CME. Thank you, Legacy Health System. Because this is CME accredited, I should mention that I have no conflicts of interest except for the meager sums I eke out from donations for this podcast. Not that my honor and integrity are not for sale. Wouldn't this be so much better if there was big pharma advertisements interspersed between the snarky commentary? I think so. Also, remember the world needs more Mark Crislip, and in attempting to meet that goal, you can listen to my Quackcast, a review of supplements, complementary, and alternative medicine, also on iTunes. I am a twice-monthly contributor to the Science-Based Medicine blog, and I churn out about 5 little ID essays a week at Rubor, Dolor, Kalor, Tumor. Now, we should move on to the literature. Don't forget, all the references are on the website. So hold on tight, ladies and gentlemen, and prepare for the ride of a lifetime. If you're like me, you wake up in the morning and you ask yourself, where the hell am I? Then once you figure out where that is, you would then ask yourself, well, what is the difference between monkeypox and chickenpox? Because you never know when an invasion of infected Congolese monkeys will swarm the United States. And that is the purpose of this article. As a rule, the difference between chickenpox and monkeypox is that monkeypox has lymphadenopathy. Monkeypox has a febrile prodrome. That's febrile for the rest of you. And monkeypox is centrifugal, whereas zoster tends to be centripetal. And I'll let you go to your dictionary to look up the difference. But monkeypox infects the palms and the soles, and chickenpox does not. Or does it? It does. In this case, looked at the transmission of varicella zoster due to palm and sole involvement during a outbreak of monkeypox in Congo. So if you get lesions on the palms and soles, it may not exclude chickenpox. Norovirus, we've talked about a lot, it being the most infectious virus maybe on the planet, requiring exactly one viral particle to cause disease. This was an outbreak that is just of interest because I like outbreaks. This was a bunch of river rafters down the Grand Canyon. And over a period of time, 137 people came down with gastroenteritis, and they traced it back to a single employee who sliced and vacuum-packed the lunch meats the day after he had a gastroenteritis, and that all these patients had the same norovirus in their stool. I recently had an outbreak of norovirus at one of my institutions that almost shut down one of the wards, and I tried to blame it on the bowl of M&Ms that was sitting in the front desk that everybody helped themselves to. I don't like to eat communal food anymore. But the take-home message is that norovirus may be the result of an unexpected point contamination in the food chain, like the guy who slices the meat for the Grand Canyon trips. You know, it's odd having to defend vaccines, which you do in this country. There's a particularly wonky group of anti-vaccination people who think it causes autism. It doesn't. That it poisons kids. It doesn't. The vaccines, along with flush toilets and good nutrition, are the major reasons that we get to be old and cranky and die of cancer instead of infectious diseases. Now, in Europe, they're having a real problem with measles vaccinations. And their rates are lower than in the United States. And they, in the last several years, have had 12,000 cases of measles reported in 32 European countries in the last 2 years, which is pretty amazing considering we get 50 a year tops, though some of the recent outbreaks have gotten us up into the 100 and 200 level of measles every year. Virtually all these cases occur in patients who have not been vaccinated or have been incompletely vaccinated for measles. Now, measles is no big deal unless you happen to be the 7 kids who died of measles. That's not a good way to die of a preventable illness. So you can get a rough death rate from measles in modern Europe, 7 out of 12,000, which is 7 too many. For historical reasons, I usually do not take care of hepatitis C patients. They are taken care of by the gastroenterologists of my hospital system. But I mention in passing, because it's interesting, that there was a study in the New England Journal of Medicine that looked at the difference between Latinos and non-Latinos for the identical treatments of hepatitis C and found that the Latinos had a significantly decreased response rate to therapy, as judged by sustained virologic suppression. 49% of whites responded, whereas 34% of Latinos responded to therapy. Why is this? Inquiring minds want to know. The discussion postulates that besides genetic reasons, the Latinos in this group had a higher body weight, more diabetes, and more fatty liver on biopsy, and these are known risk factors for lack of response to hepatitis C therapy. Guillain-Barré, like the French accent, is an ascending paralysis that can be due to Campylobacter infections. This study out of France, that's why I tried to say Guillain-Barré with a French accent, found an association between having GBS and having an influenza-like illness. Now, the incidence is rare. They had a total of 405 patients with Guillain-Barré, 234 of which they thought was due to an unidentified virus. Of these, 10 were serologically indicative of an acute influenza A infection. So it's not way common, but it was at least equivalent to a post-Campylobacter rates, more or less, for developing Guillain-Barré syndrome. This is doubly interesting for us old geezers like me, because I remember back in the 70s, Gerald R. Ford wanted everyone to get the swine flu shot. And what we saw back then was a couple of cases of Guillain-Barré associated with the influenza vaccine in the 70s for that particular strain. Although there's a real difference between giving somebody a killed vaccine and a live, real infection. Be that as it may, I think you need to add an influenza virus to potential causes of Guillain-Barré syndrome. Mais oui, c'est bon, oulala, tout de suite. Both my kids go to a French immersion school, so my French is necessarily excellent. I hope you appreciate it. Can I see a show of hands out there for everybody that's never done a show of hands before? Now, how many of you have heard of chronic idiopathic intestinal pseudo-obstruction? I haven't. This is evidently rare. I guess that's why I've never heard of it. Disease characterized, as the article says, by impaired gastrointestinal mobility without evidence of obstruction. This study out of the U.S. and Italy looked at the colons of patients with this disease and found in their colon JC virus. Now, JC virus, a polyoma virus, is what causes PML, also known as progressive multifocal leukoencephalopathy, a disease that you see primarily in AIDS patients that horrifically melts their brains. These patients get melting of their gastrointestinal nerves on biopsy, and they found evidence of JC virus as well. So, if you happen to have a patient with chronic idiopathic intestinal pseudo-obstruction, or as we like to call it in the biz, CIIP, look for JC virus. Not that you can do anything about JC virus, but at least you'll be erudite in your differential diagnosis. So what is the microbiology of an acute dental abscess? Well, it tends to be multiple things, some bugs of which I have never heard of before. And in this study, I will mention the organisms found in the mouth of an acute dental abscess, just for the fact that you get to watch me stumble over the pronunciation of bacteria. First, they're polymicrobial. Second, they often have, no surprise here, viridin streptococci with Streptococcus aeruginosus group, which is the strep that likes to cause abscesses, being the predominant streptococcus. Then, not unsurprisingly, there are anaerobic cocci, Prevotella, and Fusobacterium species, all commonly found in and around the mouth. But there are also other organisms there that you cannot grow. For example, Treponema species. Did you realize that your mouth is filled with spirochetes that aren't syphilis? Yes, indeed you do. Well, yours might be full of syphilis, but that's why you cannot do a dark field examination on the mouth. But there are also anaerobic gram-positive rods that I've never heard of, and you're going to hear about now. Prepare to giggle at my mispronunciations. These gram-positive rods include Bolidea extracta, Cryptobacterium curtum, and Mojibacterium timidum. Now, there's an old myth that the dog's mouth is cleaner than the human mouth, and that's just not true. Your mouth is a cesspool of bacteria, and when you get the dental abscess, that cesspool gets localized into the tooth. As Emeril would say, time is of the essence. Bam! Now, this turns out to be true for gram stains as well. This was a curious study. They looked at the difference in outcomes in patients who had prompt gram staining and communication of the results, i.e. less than an hour, with the not so prompt. This was usually about 3 hours on average. If your blood cultures turned positive, you got an immediate gram stain. The crude mortality in those patients was 10%, versus those who took about 3 hours to get their gram stain of a positive blood cultures, and then the subsequent dissemination of that information had a 20%, 19.2 to be exact, mortality rate. It's amazing. The difference in 3 hours of getting a gram stain out after the blood cultures turn positive can double the mortality rate in your patient. It just goes to show you that prompt diagnosis and treatment of bloodstream infections is important, with emphasis on the word prompt. When you're my age, which is 357 years in dog years, you don't sleep well. You stare at the ceiling with the collected guilt and angst of 51 years, imagining your own mortality and the ultimate heat death of the universe. But the bright side is, it causes colds. Well, it doesn't cause colds so much, but this study looked at sleep patterns and the risk of developing the common cold. And people who had less than 7 hours of sleep were almost 3 times more likely to develop a cold than those who got 8 hours or more of sleep. Also, if their sleep efficiency was high, i.e. they're not up all night because of their prostatism, they were also likely to have a cold. So poor sleep efficiency, and you had a 5.5 times more likely to develop a cold. So there's a downside to not sleeping much and not sleeping well. Now, curiously, I haven't developed a cold, even though I sleep very poorly. And I think it's because my pillow is stuffed with echinacea. So get a good night's sleep tonight, guys. You don't want to get your rhinoviral infection. As I record this podcast, we are 2 days away from getting us a new president of the United States. Now, I always figured that for the last 8 years, America was getting screwed figuratively, but it turns out, based on current CDC data, that that's maybe true literally as well. In 2007, there were 1.1 million cases of chlamydia reported, the largest number ever. And that gets to a rate of 370 cases per 100,000 population, which is a jump of 7.5% over 2006. Also, syphilis is going up. Primary and secondary cases of syphilis went from 9,700 to 11,500 in 2007. The only STD that stayed stable was gonorrhea. And it's nice to know that even with the economy collapsing around our ears, that Americans are continuing to have unprotected acquisition of sexually transmitted diseases. There are 3 articles in the January 1st Journal of Infectious Diseases that look at the efficacy of circumcision in the prevention of various sexually transmitted diseases. In one study, they showed that circumcision was protective against human papillomavirus in men, which was confirmed in a second study in a different population in the same journal. So the two studies that suggested that male circumcision decreases the chance of having human papillomavirus in men, and subsequently, of course, less chance of passing it on to their female partners. There's also a study that looked at HIV infection in heterosexual African American men and found that being circumcised was protective against developing HIV when controlled for other factors. So at least in adult men with risky behaviors, i.e. sex, circumcision appears to have some benefit in the prevention of HPV and HIV infections. Now, you'll want to have some fun. Go to the Science-Based Medicine blog and read Harriet Hall's article on the science of circumcision, and then read the comments. There are some very impassioned anti-circumcision people out there. Now, I'm not actually suggesting that anybody should put these references in the comments of the blog and then suggest that anti-circumcision advocates are actually genocidal racists who are trying to increase the death rates of African Americans and Africans by denying them circumcision. I think it'd be very inappropriate for anyone to do that, and far be it from me to suggest that such a behavior be done by others. Yes, I'm shocked to find gambling going on here. I mentioned the next one just for interest's sake. It's a case report of leptospirosis that had non-oliguric renal failure and massive magnesium wasting. I think this is interesting in that I once had a patient who had acute leptospirosis, who had profound hypocalcemia. I don't remember that we checked magnesiums. Hypocalcemia is common in dogs who get leptospirosis, but there isn't much out there for human beings. So maybe divalent cation excretion is affected in some patients, much like amphotericin in those who get leptospirosis. Hey, maybe leptospira are made from amphotericin B. That ties it all together. Another brilliant insight on my part. When I first saw the title of this article, Botulism from Drinking Pruno, I thought Pruno was some sort of laxative. Do you know what Pruno is? Well, it turns out that people in jail want to get drunk. And what they do is they get together whatever they can to ferment. The key thing to Pruno appears to be citrus fruits and ketchup as the primary ingredient. But anything that they can ferment, they will put into a bowl and get drunk off it. It's described in the article as smelling like and looking like a baby poo. I guess they didn't taste it. The thing about this outbreak is that people were using potatoes as a source for their Pruno. Now, potatoes have a long history of being associated with botulism. Baked potatoes and potato salads are just two of the forms of potatoes that become contaminated with Clostridium botulinum, which is in the soil, and then you eat them and you get botulism. So if you have someone coming in from jail with what appears to be botulism, ask them if they're drinking Pruno. And you watch. There'll be a diet Pruno and a caffeine-free Pruno and Pruno Light. There's all sorts of possibilities here. Now, if you're thinking, well, vacation time's coming up and I don't want to go to Congo because they're having monkeypox, I think I'll go to Zimbabwe instead. Maybe not such a good idea. It's depressing, but they're having a cholera outbreak in Zimbabwe. They've had nearly 35,000 cases with 1,800 deaths due to this disease. The country is evidently collapsing, and the water and sanitation systems have fallen apart, and cholera is now in the water supply of Zimbabwe. And remember, when you travel to some countries, when you get bottled water, the way that you get bottled water is they stick a bottle under the tap and fill it up and hand it to you. I would suggest that if you go to Zimbabwe, you don't drink the water. Given that the current salmonella outbreak in the United States may be traced to peanut butter, you can't eat the peanut butter, you can't drink the water. It's a good idea only to eat deep-fried foods. Aminoglycosides are not used much in this day and age, usually for the treatment of endocarditis and usually for organisms that are relatively resistant to penicillin, such as strep viridans and the enterococcus. The downside to aminoglycosides is nephrotoxicity, and this study looked at the incidence of nephrotoxicity in patients with endocarditis. And they found that the longer you were on endocarditis, the more likely you were to have a decrease in your creatinine clearance. Although this decrease in your creatinine clearance was not associated with increased mortality in endocarditis patients. Interestingly, for every day you're on gentamicin, your estimated creatinine clearance falls by about 0.5%. But, as I say, it's not associated with a alteration in outcomes in the disease in terms of mortality. And therefore, they suggest that, quote, this study does not support abolishment of gentamicin in the treatment of endocarditis. If you are a novice to this game, I would point out that you give aminoglycosides in endocarditis because you get better outcomes than if you don't. You're more likely to cure the disease. Now, it's problematic as to whether or not everybody with endocarditis are going to get valve surgery to cure their disease. But even if you whack their kidneys in some types of endocarditis, you have to give aminoglycosides. And sometimes the price you pay for microbiologic cure is renal or ototoxicities, and I explain that to my patients up front. But the presence of aminoglycoside toxicity is not in and of itself a reason not to give aminoglycoside, although it may be a reason to send the patient off to the OR to have their valve whacked out. Na-na, 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 na-na. Doodly-doo. Pretty good, huh? That's the theme to Jaws. Why would I be doing that? Well, the big problem we have in the world right now is resistant organisms, especially Staph aureus, and we're being inundated with MRSA. Currently, we have 3 crappy drugs for MRSA: vancomycin, daptomycin, linezolid. All probably equally crappy in the treatment of MRSA, but at least we have them. Daptomycin resistance occurs quickly, as does linezolid, and the mean MIC to vancomycin has been creeping up for MRSA, but we can still use it. Now, the problem is that MRSA has the potential to take genes from vancomycin-resistant enterococci and become vancomycin resistant. That has happened in the test tube by a lunatic who is trying to get the Andromeda strain growing in his lab, and it's happened in the clinical specimens as well. It's a rare event, but could happen. This study looked at the coincidence of both MRSA and VRE in patients and found a whopping 23% of patients in this study, which was done in Korea, had both VRE and MRSA at the same time. Bacteria are one giant bacteria that share multiple genomes, and one organism's DNA is another organism's DNA. The fact that they found almost a quarter of patients sharing VRE and MRSA bodes ill for the future of staphylococcal resistance. We have talked in prior podcasts how the new 7-valent vaccine for kids for pneumococcus has decreased disease not only in kids but in adults. New England Journal of Medicine shows that as a result of the vaccine, there's also been a marked decrease in Streptococcus pneumoniae meningitis, both in children who receive the vaccine and in adults as well. Unfortunately, this appears to be a temporary phenomenon, as the ecological niches that were emptied out by the vaccine are currently being filled by other strains of strep pneumo, and as a result, strains that are not covered by the vaccine are now causing meningitis, including some strains that are resistant, or as they say nowadays, non-susceptible to antibiotics. As I keep saying, no good deed ever goes unpunished. If we could just come out with an 84-valent vaccine, we could eradicate invasive pneumococcal disease in everybody. And this would be nice to have a conjugate vaccine for the strains of pneumococcus, like the Prevnar, because the current one we give adults is not that great a vaccine. In fact, there was a meta-analysis in the Canadian Medical Journal that looked at all the studies of the efficacy of the pneumococcal vaccine we use in adults, the 23-valent crappy vaccine, and they found it is of questionable efficacy in this meta-analysis. Now, meta-analyses have issues in and of themselves. And it's interesting, especially if you review the quack world, where in some meta-analyses you'll benefit with the same data set that others find no benefit. And the history of meta-analyses is that they only are about 50-50 for predicting the results of good clinical trials. However, this is a fairly compelling meta-analysis, and that they did look at methodological quality of the clinical trials, and they found that in the really good trials, the vaccine did not decrease pneumonia and did not decrease pneumococcal pneumonia. The Pneumovax, therefore, at least for prevention of pneumonia, may not be doing diddly. Some studies have shown that it doesn't prevent pneumonia, but it does prevent you from dying if you should get pneumonia, which I think is a good outcome, but they don't address that particular issue. There was a study published in CID a little while back that I consider myself to be the Queen Victoria of infectious diseases. The prior study looked at the results in patients who were randomized to receive either clarithromycin or not intravenously for their sepsis, and found an increase in survival in patients that got the intravenous macrolide. And the study was valid in patients whether or not they had a macrolide susceptible organism or not. Macrolides decreased mortality. Is this been held true in a second study, which was retrospective, unfortunately, but they looked back at a series of patients with severe sepsis and pneumonia. They had 237 patients, and about half of them received macrolides. Those who had macrolides and severe sepsis had decreased mortality due to pneumonia, despite the fact they had macrolide-resistant pathogens. As I've said before, I've always thought that the efficacy of macrolides was due to the fact that they were screwing up bacterial protein synthesis, and that means that the organisms are not making the virulence factors what kills you. Now, it may be the fact that macrolides do have some mild immunomodulatory effects, such as you see with statins, and that perhaps the benefit you're getting with severe sepsis and pneumonia is not due to the antibiotic efficacy, but to the immunomodulatory efficacy of the macrolides. So now we got two studies to show, one retrospective, one prospective, that macrolides decrease mortality in patients with sepsis. What makes infectious diseases continually too cool for school is all the epidemiology of diseases. You never know where the hell someone's going to get an infection from. Prior podcast, we talked about an outbreak of Legionella downwind from a cooling tower, but there's more bugs can be found in cooling tower than just Legionella. This study looked at the microbiology of 3 cooling towers in downtown Paris, and they grew 33 different isolates of mycobacterial strains. That turned out to be 5 species. They grew Fortunum, Concepciones, Cheloniae, Chimera, and Phocaicum, Phocaicum. These mycobacterium also can live in free-living amoeba, which has also been associated with Legionella infections, and evidently with M. Cheloniae as well. So if you have someone who presents with an infiltrate and they're a professional cooling tower cleaner, you might want to worry about more than Legionella, but consider the atypical mycobacterium as well. 2 reports, one in CID, just talked about transfusion-related babesia, which there's been about 70 cases in the United States, and just being wary that people can get unusual infections from transfusion. Emerging Infections, though, had a more interesting article, which was a case of Plasmodium falciparum malaria long after leaving an endemic area. It turned out that it was probably what they call luggage or suitcase malaria, that he got exposed from a friend's mosquito that was brought over in a suitcase, and that gave him malaria. Mosquitoes do travel, and there's always these odd cases of malaria that show up in people that have no exposure history. Keep in mind that the mosquito may come to your patient rather than your patient going to the mosquito. And so if someone has a febrile illness, especially one with a pattern suggestive of malaria, it is not totally off the wall to check thick and thin malaria smears. I have yet to hit pay dirt by doing this, but I keep in mind that you can go to the infection or the infection can come to you, be it salmonella in your peanut butter or Plasmodium falciparum in your suitcase. This is a little out of my usual order, but I forgot to mention this study. Last time we talked about Pseudomonas in COPD and how patients may do worse if they have chronic colonization with Pseudomonas and COPD. This is another study that looked at 50 patients with Pseudomonas and COPD and 50 who did not, and found almost twice the mortality rate in those that had Pseudomonas, 60% at 2 years compared to 28% in the non-Pseudomonas colonized group. So it appears that Pseudomonas in the COPD patient is a lot like Pseudomonas in cystic fibrosis patients, that they do worser long term. And so, as the 30-minute mark looms, we bring this Persiflager's Puscast to an end. Review the infectious disease literature for the last 2 weeks with commentary. References, including some not mentioned in the podcast, are on the website. This is CME accredited. Take the online quiz and get a half an hour of free CME thanks to Legacy Health System. This has been brought to you by Pusware LLC, the publisher of the Persiflager's Annotated Compendium of Infectious Facts, Dogma, and Opinion, your Uber hyperlinked electronic guide to infectious diseases at pusware.com. If you like this, listen to my Quackcast on iTunes. If you like either of them, write me a glowing review and feed my ravenous ego. And since the biggest problem with the world is it needs more Mark Crislip, you can read my ramblings at sciencebasedmedicine.org and at Rubor Dolor Kalor Tumor, my infectious disease blog. As always, the music is by my son when he was 12 years old, improvising on the guitar. This is copyright 2009 with a Creative Commons license. Bandwidth ain't free, so feel free to purchase the compendium and support this podcast. And as always, thank you for this most interesting consultation and allowing me to participate in the care of this most difficult and challenging case. I will continue to follow along with you, and I hope my dictation has sufficient detail to warrant the level of billing. Thank you, and dictation. Goodbye.